Hello everybody, welcome back to another video lecture. So today we're going to take a look at William Lane Craig. Here he is right here, contemporary American thinker, writer. He very much straddles the academic and public worlds. So he's a research professor at a university in the United States. He's written a lot of books, been a lot of publications. Mainly really on theology and philosophy of religion. He runs this website that I've directed you to, reasonablefaith.org, that has the reading for this piece. One thing I think that's lovely about Craig is that he's quite clear in what he's trying to argue, which is, I think, always useful no matter what we think of the merits of whatever it is we're looking at. If it's clear, at least we know what it is, and so we can try to think about it as clearly as possible. So this piece is their meaning in life. The reading is really Craig's initial prepared remarks that he gave during a public debate or public forum he had in Toronto in 2018 with Rebecca Goldstein and Jordan Peterson about, what is it that makes for a meaningful life. Craig took the position that you really have to have theism, and that's what we're going to see in these prepared remarks here. The other two took different positions. I won't get into that. That's not our topic. But if you're interested in what Craig's saying here, I encourage you go watch it. You can easily find it on YouTube. There's, in fact, a link right from the website I directed you to here for the reading. It's a very interesting piece. You can go listen to the remarks rather than read the piece. If you are going to be using it, citing it, I ask you to use the version I've directed you to, and it doesn't have page numbers, so you can cite it by paragraph numbers, which is a little bit clunkier, but it still works, and it still gives your reader some information so they know where to go looking if you are saying that something's going on in the text. And of course, you might look at my slides and say, hey, you don't put in page numbers or paragraph numbers when you produce quotations, and that's on purpose, in part because I'm trying to get you to go look at the text and make good use of them. So what does Craig do in this piece? Well, really, there's going to be four big things that happen, or at least, my counting, there's four big things. So we're first going to get this claim or this argument that if God does not exist, then there's no transcendent reality. And if there's no transcendent reality, so this is really the second point, what falls out of that. Another way to think about that, right? Having no transcendent reality, that really is the same as atheism being true. There's nothing more to reality than what we already think and see and so on. It's just a material universe. We're material beings, and we're born into it. Eventually we're going to die, things are going to end, and so on. So if there's no transcendent reality, that is, if there is no God, then human life is absurd or meaningless because it lacks ultimate purpose, value, or significance. And so we're going to hear Craig really make a case for all three of those. So what is it for life to lack ultimate purpose, value, or significance? Because ultimately he thinks meaning is really those three things together. At least we can pick apart meaning, and if we're talking about a meaningful life, we can talk about a life that has purpose, a life that has value, a life that has significance, and he wants to think about those in ultimate terms. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Next, he argues if Christian theism is true, then there really is a meaning to human life, because human life can meet the two necessary conditions, the two conditions that need to be met for human life to be meaningful, which is that God exists and that we are immortal, because he thinks if those two things are true, then we can have ultimate purpose, value, and significance, as we're going to come to see. And then finally, just as a closing note, at the end of the piece, Craig makes clear that nothing he said here actually provides an argument in favor of theism being true. That is, he hasn't given us any reason to believe God actually exists. Rather, all he's really been giving us an argument for is that if we want our lives to be meaningful, then we need to be theists. And so he thinks we ought to live as theists if we can, because of the benefits it provides. Okay, so with that outline in place, let's go ahead and get into it. So, as I noted, the first point Craig really makes here is that if God does not exist, there's no transcendent reality, and so both mankind and the universe are, as a result, inevitably doomed to death. And again, transcendent reality, really some kind of that there's some part or component of reality that transcends or goes beyond our usual experience of the material world around us. So basic facts. Basic facts I think we can all agree on. In fact, Craig, in his remarks, is engaging with some various atheist thinkers, some of which we'll look at in this course, others we won't really. So we'll bump into a few of them along the way here. But agreed upon facts between theist and atheist alike. Each individual is doomed to die. We're barring something highly unusual happening. Every individual human is going to die at some point. Every living creature is going to die at some point. And in fact, as Craig notes, our best scientific theories tell us that the whole universe is doomed to die in some sense. So if you take, that is, eventually it's not going to be able to support life, and really nothing's going to be going on. So Craig puts it in pretty evocative terms. If you read the piece, he talks about dead stars and the husks of galaxies and things like that. But he's basically right. So the best or best regarded or most widely believed cosmological theory at this point, so theory about the origins of the universe, how the universe started, where's it headed, and so on. Well, most widely agreed upon starting point is the Big Bang. So right now, when we look around at the various stars and galaxies, we see them all moving away from each other. So, and this is really the result of 20th century astronomical observations. If you look around at the night sky with powerful telescopes, what you see is really everything we look at is red-shifted. The light from the various stars and galaxies is all shifted to the red end of the spectrum. That happens when something is moving away from you. So everything is moving away from us. And so the best explanation for that is really that everything in the universe is moving away from everything else over time. The universe is expanding, which means if we go back in time, right, when time's going backwards, everything was closer and closer together. Eventually, of course, it would all smash together into a singularity. Everything would be packed right in as tight as it could possibly be. And that would, at some point, explode, or there'd be a big bang, where everything spreads out. Now, of course, as things are spreading out, they're just going to keep spreading further and further. Now, one thought in the 20th century, really into the 21st century, is, well, shouldn't gravity at some point sort of slow that expansion and pull it back in so things wind up crunching together? Well, the thought was, yeah, maybe that could happen, or maybe everything's really static, or could be accelerating outwards. Those are really the three scenarios. Observations in the late 20th into 21st centuries have now verified that, to the best of our knowledge, things are actually accelerating as they expand. So what's going to happen in the future, and this is really what Craig's talking about, over time, of course, massive, huge amounts of time, but over time, things are going to get further and further and further apart, so that the various parts of the universe are effectively cut off from various other parts of the universe. You won't be able to travel between them at all. And of course, the energy that's in the universe is getting used up. So, our sun is a star, and there are trillions of other stars that are going through certain sorts of reactions and processes, and they're using up energy that isn't going to be refilled, at least not from anything we're aware of. So really what Craig's talking about is that eventually, fast forward quite a long time, this is going to happen next week. I don't have a timeline. My guess would be something like billions of years, perhaps even trillions of years. But if you look forward into the future enough, ultimately, what do you get? Nothingness. There's no stars burning. There's no available energy to support life. There's, it's just dark. And so there will be, presumably, these sort of husks of stars and so on. There will be material around, but nothing that can do anything. It's just cold, dark, nothing. That's really what the future has in store for us, according to our best current scientific theories. And this is what Craig is talking about. So here again, this is something that theist and atheist should be able to agree on. There's potential room for disagreement here if there's some sort of shortcoming with our scientific theories. And of course, new observations could tell us something different. We could wind up revising those theories at some point. But right now, that's a point of common ground for theist and atheist alike. And so Craig's really just trying to relate sort of what our best science currently tells us. And so far as he tells it, I think he's right. Now, unless there's some kind of transcendent reality, there's God, there's some other plane of existence, there's something like heaven or perhaps hell, Craig argues that ultimately human life becomes absurd, which he really means meaningless here, And so he trades off in a few places using some different terms. So he's talking about a meaningful life, and of course we can think about a meaningless life. But as synonyms for a meaningless life, he also uses absurd life. He also talks about futile lives at some point, or kind of futile existence. We're certainly going to see some other thinkers, notably Camus and Nagel, some others as well, take up the terminology of life being absurd. And we're going to see what it is for them exactly they define absurdity as, because they're going to try to be clearer on it than Craig is really here. So we're going to see some of these terms come up later, but just for the purpose of understanding Craig, when he's talking about life being absurd, he's really talking about being meaningless. So human life in general, or human lives in particular, my life, your life, are absurd or meaningless in such a world with no extra parts to it, no God, no heaven, nothing beyond these agreed upon scientific facts, because such lives lack ultimate purpose, value, or significance. Right? If this is all existence has to offer for us, right, eventually we each individually will die, our whole species will die, eventually the whole universe will die, in the sense that nothing's going to be going on. There's going to be no living creatures, no interesting interactions, no energy available to do anything. It's just going to be this cold, dark, ever-expanding, sometimes nothing. Well, in that kind of world, you can't have room for ultimate purpose, value, or significance, Craig holds. And so you need those things to have a meaningful existence or to have a meaningful life. So Craig's view, what's a meaningful life? One with ultimate purpose, ultimate value, and ultimate significance. So let's hear a little bit more about each of these, because Craig nicely organizes his piece and separates them out. It says, okay, so there are these three things, and here's what they're like. I want to explain how we lose each of them on that kind of secular, materialist, scientific picture, if there's nothing more to existence. So let's hear about each of them, and then we'll see what kind of conclusions Craig draws from these points. So first, ultimate purpose. Now, as Craig explains, purpose has to do with a goal, a reason for something. When we think about purposes, we think about our goal-oriented behavior. One of the questions I asked in the introductory forum, why are you taking this course? We ask that sort of question for all sorts of things. Somebody's doing something, we often ask, well, why are you doing that? We look around, say, at nature. We can often ask, well, why do things work that way? Right? What's the function for, say, the different organs in a body, right, in a biological organism? What function do these things play? What's the reason it's there? What's its goal or purpose? Right? So, Craig is really talking about ultimate purposes and ultimate values and ultimate, the third thing. We'll get around back to it. If I had better video editing software, I'd get rid of these silly little parts to the videos, but I don't, at least right now. Not to my awareness do I have such software, so you're stuck with stupid little sides like that. So when we're thinking about ultimate, what is it that makes something ultimate? The word ultimate comes from Latin, medieval Latin, really meaning sort of last or final, most important, right? It's fairly commonly understood what ultimate means, but when we're thinking about ultimate purpose, it's not just some purpose, right? It's really the last or final or most important purpose. So we need to keep that in mind. That's ultimately what Craig is interested in here. And that's precisely one area that we're going to see some other thinkers engage with, and some of the questions that I want to pose to you for the Craig reading. This question of, why does it matter what the ultimate version of all these things are? Or does it so matter? So there are certainly purposes in our lives, right? That seems pretty obvious. Somebody barged into my office right now and said, hey, why are you making that video, right? What's the purpose of doing it? I can give an answer, right? Well, I'm making this video to help my students understand the Craig article, right? And say, oh, why are you doing that? Well, because I want them to understand this piece as well as all the other pieces in the course, so they can, think more clearly about the meaning of life and some really thoughtful and interesting points people have made over time about that, so they can reflect on it and think about it for themselves and come to a clear understanding of what this issue is and what their own view is about it, and why they hold that view, what their reasons are. So they'd say, yeah, but why do you want to help them do that? I don't know. Say something like, well, makes them better people overall, makes them, I think, engaging in this kind of issue itself is important, just as a reflective human being. Engaging this kind of activity will help increase their skills, clarify their thinking, let them express themselves more clearly, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Yeah, but why does that matter? Well, I could talk about why it's important to have, thoughtful, interesting, talented people. Yeah, why does that matter? Well, I could talk about the fate of the human species. Yeah, why does that matter? Well, maybe at that point I'm starting to slip, right? Why does it matter if the human species as a whole continues? Oh, I'm not sure. It seems pretty important to me. And then they might, go on and say things. Why does it matter if our whole solar system continues to exist or anything else, right? All of the purposes that we point to tend to be fairly localized, right? Our purposes in life tend to be fairly limited. But Craig's point is that there really seems to be no purpose to life. We've got purposes in our lives, right? We've got our own purposes, our goals, our reasons for doing things. When we think about the reason for existing in general, or the reason for having such purposes and goals, for acting in certain sorts of ways, it seems like really there's no good reason we're here. Broadly speaking, why I exist, I can give you a kind of causal explanation for it, but if we're thinking in terms of purposes, where am I heading? What's my goal? What's my reason for existence? I could maybe tell you something about why I think I exist, or what it is I'm aiming at, or trying to achieve in my life, or something like that. But somebody could then ask, okay, yeah, but let's set aside your own personal view on the matter. Stepping outside of yourself, can you point to any, goal or reason for your existing in general? Why you're here, where you're headed. That's where Craig thinks ultimately we're going to have to answer there just isn't one. If we're stuck with that secular materialist world that science really reveals to us, right? If there is no God, if there's no transcendent reality, there's nothing above and beyond just what we see around us in this material world and our limited life, then there's really no ultimate purpose there. Now, Craig points to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, which, so lovely story, really. Wells, one of the sort of fathers of science fiction, really invented our notion of time travel, using a time machine, that phrase and that notion of moving through time using some kind of device. So here's a picture of Wells down in the corner. Now, Craig talks about Wells a little bit. He talks about in the time machine, the time traveler goes ahead into the future, past when humans are gone. So visits a future version of the Earth where there's really nothing happening. It's just the sound of waves, and there's some moss or something growing, but really all other life is extinguished. It's just, in some sense, barren. There's still life, but not in the sense we tend to be very interested in. There's no human life, there aren't any human purposes or anything. Now, for Craig, that's a horrifying vision. That's a terrible thought. In fact, he shares when he first read that story when he was younger, he really recoiled and thought, no, that must not be how things wind up. That's terrible. That's awful. But that's really the kind of future science has in store for us. Now, of course, we can try to put that off. We say, well, look, even if in a million years or a billion years or whatever it is, humans don't exist anymore, and Earth has been, sort of wiped out, or this kind of thing. Even if in the future we cease to exist and our whole species cease to exist, at least we're here now. Doesn't that matter, right? Can't we still have purposes now, and there can be purposes to our existence even if it's finite? Craig doesn't think so. He thinks even if we look at what we're doing now, we're merely at an earlier point on the purposeless rush toward oblivion, as he puts it. So without some kind of ultimate purpose at the end of all things, some kind of final or last or most important purpose, all the other purposes seem to fall away for Craig. Right? They don't really matter. And so they can't contribute to meaning in our lives. Next, think about ultimate value. Right? As he puts it, if God does not exist, there's no ultimate value in life. Now, for Craig, value is really moral value. We'll get into this a little bit more as the course goes on, and certainly, at least here, I'm going to poke at this a little bit. we can think about moral values, certainly. So I'm not denying that we can think about moral values, something being, as Craig puts it, good or evil, right or wrong. But it's not obvious to me that all value is moral value. What do I mean by that? Well, we can certainly think in terms of moral value. We can also think in terms of aesthetic or artistic value, right? The sort of value something has not as a moral object or action, but aesthetically, right? Artistically, something can be valuable, have a kind of value as a piece of art, separate from its value as a moral action or product or thing in general. I believe we can also think of value in other sorts of terms. So we can think about moral value, somebody being good or evil or something like that. But then we can also think in more value or morally neutral terms about something's value. So about how effective something is, right? How good at a particular task something is. So look, if I have a knife, right? A knife is sort of made for cutting. If I have a nice knife that's nice and sharp and cuts very well, it's valuable. It's a good knife, but not good in the sense of being morally good, right? Knives aren't the sorts of things in and of themselves that are morally or good or not. So the knife can be good or bad, right? Not so good. It can have more or less value as a knife. Well, it's not clear, at least not to me, that value is necessarily moral value. So I think Craig is a little bit hasty here in conflating value with moral value or moral worth, which is not to say that he's wrong that moral worth or moral value is a kind of value, and certainly an important one and an interesting one. Now, this question about moral value is one we're also going to come back to near the end of the course, so it's not going to disappear right off our radar, but this is going to be something that comes up as we're moving along. Think about different sorts of values and which ones really matter when we're thinking about a meaningful life. So, just coming back to Craig. So I had this little bit of an aside here, though I think Craig was a little bit hasty on conflating value with moral worth or moral value. But coming back just to what he's saying, value has to do with something moral worth. It's being good or evil, right or wrong. For moral value to be ultimate, it must be objective. This is how I'm really putting Craig's point. But he talks about moral standards. So we're thinking about trying to figure out whether or not something's good or evil or right or wrong. And another little quick aside, so good and evil, these are really adjectives, so we describe things as good or evil, say people, right? Right or wrong are really adverbs, so they apply to actions, right? You can act rightly or wrongly, you are good or evil, right? But individual people aren't right or wrong. And we can talk, at least in some sense, about an action being good or evil, but generally speaking, actions are right or wrong, people are good or evil. So, people are things. So think about morals and moral value, moral worth. Craig is interested in moral standards, right? If we're trying to figure out if something is a particular action is right or wrong, or someone's good or evil, how do we do that? Well, you have to have some kind of standard, some kind of measuring stick, right? Some way of determining if it's right or wrong, because these things aren't always obvious. Now, for such standards to be objective, Craig says they have to be valid and binding independently of human opinion. So for him, for moral standards to be objective, they have to be something that transcend or go beyond mere human opinion, because of course humans disagree. Only God can provide such objective standards, Craig thinks. So Craig dismisses the possibility that there can be objective moral standards without God, because if there isn't a God, then what we're left with is really just the disagreement amongst humans. Now, a secular worldview, right, one without God, really doesn't have any room for these objective moral standards, because, as Craig puts it, all we are confronted with is, in Jean-Paul Sartre's words, the bare, valueless fact of existence. So there's Sartre down in the corner, 20th century French author, playwright, philosopher. So Sartre was an existentialist. As I said, wrote a number of artistic pieces, a number of philosophical pieces as well. Was really basically a rock star in France, particularly in the post-World War II period. We're going to read something by Albert Camus later in this course, and Camus and Sartre are in some sense close to each other philosophically, and they were friends for a while and then not so friendly for a while. So we're going to read something of Camus. We're not going to read Sartre directly, but really, here again, I think Craig is right, at least in his characterization of Rousseau, Dawkins, and Sartre. For all three of those thinkers, they seem committed to the view that the universe on its own, or nature on its own, has no values. Right? It's not the sort of thing that makes distinctions between good and evil or right and wrong. It doesn't think some things have values and others don't. It's just not a personal being like that. So really, value is a human creation. It's a human invention. It's really a product of us and the way we think and approach the world. So there's just no use in thinking about value independently of humans. This is exactly what Craig's getting at. He wants really objective moral standards. Without those sorts of standards, then really we're just left with our various views, our various opinions on moral matters and matters of value, without any way of being able to decide between the sides in various sorts of disagreements. As Craig puts it in one point, I haven't stuck it on here, who are we to decide who's really right and who's really wrong when we look at conflicts of value if we don't think that there's God or any sort of objective moral standards? And here again, I'm just going to sort of throw out a little bit of a question here. Is it possible that there can be objective moral standards or objective values, broadly speaking, without God or some kind of personal being? Right? Could it be possible that God, if God doesn't exist, that there could still be objective values or some kind of objective morality that transcends mere human opinion? So could it be possible that, in fact, some people really are wrong about values and morals, even though there isn't a God there to say, this is what's right and this is what's wrong, that's good and this is evil, and so on? So Craig certainly doesn't think so. All right, I'm just putting this out here as a question. Do you think he's right? Because he's made this claim here, but he hasn't really given us a reason for that claim yet. But if Craig's right on this point, without God, you can't have objective moral standards, you really can't have objective value. If that's true, and if a meaningful life requires such ultimate value or objective value, then it seems like there's one more thing that human lives will lack if God doesn't exist. Next, on to ultimate significance. As Craig puts it, significance has to do with something's importance, why it matters. Right? So significance is something a little bit different from value, something a little bit different from purpose. We can have a purpose that's not significant. We can talk about value that itself perhaps isn't significant. And we can talk about significance on its own without the other two as well. Now, if our lives end in death, if the material world is all there is, there's no transcendent reality, there's no great beyond, there's nothing over and above the world as we see it now, the sort of world science attempts to study, then there's no ultimate significance or importance to our existence, including to what we did while we existed. Right? Our actions don't really matter in the end, because ultimately nothing's going to exist. So it doesn't really matter what we did while we were here, because at the end of it all, there's just going to be nothing. Think back to Tolstoy, it's all going to end with stench and worms. Right? Though I guess Craig takes it even farther than that. He says, well, it's not just stench and worms, that's sort of short-term thinking. You go really long-term, there won't be smells, there won't be worms, there won't be anything. It's just cold, dark oblivion. Now, Craig tells us, says, look, one's life may be important relative to certain other events. So if we think about what's going on, the fact that I continue to live is something more important to, I don't know, whether or not something else happens. Say, just something trivial. I rip a sheet of paper or break a pen or something in my office here. The fact that I continue living on and that my life happened does seem to be more important than, say, the event of a piece of paper being ripped or a pen being broken or something like that. So Craig admits we can make these sorts of relative assessments about how important things are relative to each other. But unless there's some kind of ultimate significance, unless, at the end there's some kind of final or most important kind of significance, that relative importance or significance ceases to matter, right? Ultimately, it's irrelevant that our lives are relatively more important than certain other sorts of things that might be happening right now, given that at the end of all things, it's all going to be gone, and none of it will have mattered anyway. Right? Even if we existed at the end of the universe, as Craig tried to paint a picture of at the start of this talk, even if we were there, there'd be really nothing to see, nothing to measure, nothing to do. So there wouldn't be any way of telling what had really happened, what had come before. Right? Did you lead a good life or not? In a trillion years, it's just really not going to matter. Now, something underlying all of this is that Craig's concern with the ultimate significance and purpose and value is that really the correct standpoint on Craig's view appears to be something like a God's eye view, but of course, if we're debating about whether or not God exists and thinking in terms of theism versus atheism in general, then talking about a God's eye view itself seems a little question-begging or seems to presuppose that God exists. So a couple of other ways to put this point is that Craig really seems to be concerned with the standpoint of eternity, right? Or something like the point of view of the universe, or the view from nowhere. There are different ways we can talk about this. But ultimately, that's really what Craig thinks matters. Now, this is something I don't think he quite comes out and clearly states. I think it's quite clear that he's committed to this from the rest of his remarks, but he himself doesn't come out really just sort of put this on the table, which is why I'm doing it now. So what seems presupposed by this whole discussion of ultimate significance, purpose, and value is that really the correct standpoint from which to judge the meaningfulness of lives in general, or the meaningfulness of a particular life, is from this end of all things perspective. That's really the right one. I'm flagging this now because we're going to see, moving forward, some thinkers specifically flag that point and call it into question and give some reasons for why that might not actually be the right standpoint from which to make these sorts of assessments. Okay, and so I suppose we could put that just in the form of a question right now. Is Craig right that the correct standpoint to judge the meaningfulness of human lives in general, or the meaningfulness of our particular lives, is really from this, standpoint of eternity or end of all things, or the point of view of the universe? All right, so pulling together the threads of these 3 points that we've been seeing and what Craig was really saying at the start, as he puts it, on atheism, or I'd rather say something like the atheistic perspective, but we can set that aside. So on atheism, life itself becomes ultimately meaningless. If God does not exist, then life is without ultimate purpose, value, or significance. Right? It follows from God's not existing that life would lack these things. Now here again, just going back to what I was talking about in the introduction to philosophical argumentation and some of that earlier documentation, this point's framed conditionally, right? It's an if-then. So when we think in conditional terms, Craig isn't saying here that God doesn't exist. Craig's just saying, look, if God doesn't exist, then something else is going to follow from that. So when you've got that if-then coupling, whatever's in the if position, really what we're saying is that if that initial thing is true, if it turns out that really God doesn't exist, then it must follow that it's also true that life is without ultimate purpose, value, or significance. But that's not saying God doesn't exist yet. It's just saying if God doesn't exist, if it turns out that's true, then this is what's going to follow from it. So atheism necessarily leads to nihilism and ultimately despair. Now, nihilism is really just another interesting term to look up and sort of read about if you want to dig into things a little bit more deeply, but really the view that there are no values, right? So this view that there is no ultimate purpose, value, or significance, that's, I'd say, being committed to those points is really what it is to be a nihilist, right? Or nihilism is really committed to that. There really is no ultimate purpose, value, or significance. And this, Craig thinks, leads to despair. If you are clear-sighted about that, you realize that these things aren't there, ultimately you're going to despair. You're not going to be happy, Right? As Craig puts it, it's impossible to live consistently and happily within the framework of atheism. Why? Because to be happy, we must see our lives as having purpose, value, and significance. Right? And maybe I should have even put in here ultimate purpose, value, and significance. Because, of course, Craig is interested in the ultimate version of each of these things. Because he thinks without some ultimate purpose, other purposes don't matter. Without some ultimate value, there's really no values at all. Without some kind of ultimate significance, all other forms of significance drop away. So here's just a picture of Nietzsche. So here again, Craig mentions Nietzsche and reads a little excerpt from one of Nietzsche's books, The Gay Science. Part of me wants to sort of stick a bunch of Nietzsche in this course as well, and I was tempted to do so, but of course I filled up this course schedule and looked around and said, well, short of making you do a whole bunch of extra work, I'm not sure how we're going to shoehorn this in here. But Nietzsche, a very, very interesting 19th century German philosopher, a thinker. He's also a philologist, a classicist, studied ancient Greek literature. Nietzsche is very famous for pronouncing the death of God, or at least that occurring in some of his works, and that's really what Craig is reading about. And Craig commends Nietzsche for at least being clear-sighted about what atheism or nihilism really means. That in fact, if God is dead, and by that Nietzsche was really getting at that God's become unbelievable in a modern, scientific, secular age. We just don't need God to explain anything anymore. God's just not believable. Craig says Nietzsche at least realized the implications of that if you lose God, it's not like things just carry on as normal. Rather, something really important has been lost from your whole worldview. That really the existence of God was really at the foundation of values and purposes and significance. God, as a sort of an intellectual concept, was there as a way to explain why the universe is here, how things started, where they're headed, why we matter, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, why those things matter. And if you think back to Fackenheim from the previous lecture, in some sense, Fackenheim very much agrees, right? Says, look, God is just the most important thing that there is. So there's no point in thinking of things like purposes, values, significance, meaning beyond God. Given that God is there, really humans' most ultimate meaning is really in their relationship with God. And that's precisely why the covenant is so important. So Nietzsche realizes that if you lose God, you don't just lose some extra, some hypothetical posit, some simple thing. We just like, oh yeah, I don't believe in that anymore. And everything else is fine and nothing else needs to change. Nietzsche realized the kind of despair and the sorts of problems that can come out of that. So Craig says, really, Nietzsche gets it right. He realizes how serious this is. Unlike a lot of modern atheists, this is still Craig, a lot of modern atheists don't seem to get how world-shattering giving up on God really is. They want to give up on God and then everything's just fine, right? You can be happy and you can lead a good life and everything's meaningful and there's still purposes. Nothing else really changes by giving up belief in God. And Craig thinks ultimately that's wrong. If you give up on belief in God, you cannot consistently live happily anymore. Because if you're an atheist, you have to give up on ultimate purpose, value, and significance, and you have to have those things to lead a happy life. So the only way you can be a happy atheist is by being inconsistent and really concealing the truth from yourself. Nietzsche himself, just to paraphrase him, really came to the view that the truth is terrible, right? Nietzsche himself really put forward, God doesn't exist, and that's a horrible realization. So now we're faced with an interesting question. What's better? To live with the truth, to know that God doesn't exist and to have to deal with that, or to live in a comforting illusion? We're going to come back to that point at the end of Craig's piece here. So in contrast to meaningless atheism, we can have a meaningful Christian theism. So Christian theism, on Craig's account, meets the two necessary conditions for meaningful existence. Now, he himself so I'm going to put it into his terms and try to do a little bit to explain here, because I think he slides between a couple of ways of trying to make his point. I don't think that undercuts the point, so I don't think Craig's incoherent or anything like that here, but I think it could make what he's saying just a little bit more difficult to follow than it needs to be. So Craig says there are these two necessary conditions that need to be met for meaningful existence: the existence of God and personal immortality. For the conditions to be necessary means that if the conditions aren't met, then you can't have whatever it is they are necessary conditions for. So in this case, a meaningful existence or a meaningful life. So why are these two conditions necessary? Why do we have to have God exist, and why do we have to have personal immortality? This is where ultimately it connects back to those three things Craig was talking about: ultimate value, purpose, and significance. Because if God exists and we're immortal, then we get these three things Craig has been talking about, which, so it seems like the existence of God and personal immortality are two necessary conditions for being able to have ultimate purpose, value, and significance. And having ultimate purpose, value, and significance is necessary to have a meaningful life. So we could formulate this in a more rigorous way, saying the existence of God and personal immortality are necessary conditions for having ultimate purpose, value, and significance, and having ultimate purpose, value, and significance are necessary conditions for having a meaningful life. And there's, so you have to go from sort of A to B to C. So it all fits together, logically speaking, but it does make it a little bit complicated. So God's existence provides us with an ultimate purpose, Craig thinks, and that purpose is to know him and enjoy him forever. Right? That is just what the purpose of being human ultimately is. God's existence also provides us with an objective standard of value, so we get ultimate value. Lastly, immortality gets us eternal significance. So it's because we are personally immortal that what we do ultimately matters in the end. Now, one other set of questions I want to raise here is just whether or not things really work the way Craig does. So for instance, if we weren't immortal, but God existed and always remembered what we did while we did exist, could that provide us with eternal significance? I'm not sure. It's the genuine question. Thinking alternatively, and we're going to see this come up in Nozick next day, so I'm not going to belabor the point. Craig says God's existence gives us an ultimate purpose, right? He says, here it is. Does it matter whether or not we find that to be a good purpose, whether or not that's something we want to do? Where does our own subjective view or choice fit into this, if anywhere? Craig doesn't really elaborate. Thinking about objective standard of values. What is it exactly about the existence of God and God's attitudes towards questions of value, right? What things are good and bad, good and evil, right and wrong? What is it exactly about God's own attitudes that sets those objective standards? In what sense is somebody doing something wrong by rebelling against God's assessments there? Again, we'll raise that with Nozick, and I want to note I'm raising all of those as legitimate questions, not rhetorical questions. So I'm not sort of posing these questions saying, oh, well, look, there's no way the theist can answer that question. So obviously there's something incoherent about Craig's view or the theistic view. I'm posing those as legitimate questions. Those are meaningful, interesting questions. Theists can answer them, atheists can answer them. Perhaps there can be disagreements. Perhaps there can be good reasons for more than one answer. Maybe not. Right? Maybe on reflection after you work all the way through it, the reasons really stack up on one side of the answer. But they're real questions to ask. And they're questions and issues Craig doesn't really get into. So part of what I'm trying to point at here is, okay, well, here's what Craig's saying, and it's nice and clear, I think clearer than say, Tolstoy was, at least in a certain kind of way. I think Craig is certainly giving us something a little bit more than Fackenheim and Quinn. How much more? Open question, but I think there's a little bit more to the distinctions he's drawing and the claims he's making here. But then there are these additional questions and topics. There are these further places to explore and to go. So just coming back here, just to the main point. In Craig's view, if you're an atheist, ultimately you have to accept that life is ultimately meaningless, and so you can't really be happy as an atheist. You can't have a meaningful life, you can't have a happy life, unless you're really tricking yourself and being inconsistent. On the other hand, though, Christian theism does provide for a meaningful life. It meets the conditions that are really required. Now, Craig himself doesn't really mention or explore precisely what versions of theism provide for this kind of meaningful life. So he's, unless I missed something, he's fairly explicit when he talks about Christian theism. That's really the perspective he's coming from. So what about other views? What about Jewish theism or Islamic theism? What about a kind of Hindu theism or a Buddhist theism or something like that? Maybe it's not even right to think about Buddhism in terms of theism. Maybe. But, and so this is a question that came up with Quinn as well. To what extent are other theistic traditions able to meet the necessary conditions for a meaningful life? It's something Craig doesn't really touch on, but I think it's worth raising. And of course, it's worth raising both to Craig. What would Craig say, or does it seem like Craig has resources here to give us some kind of answer, even though he's explicitly given us one? Can we construct the answer for him? And then there's the second question of whether or not Craig's right. So what does Craig think, or what would Craig think based on what he's written? And then is Craig right in that answer? What's really the right answer and why? So now coming to this question, I mentioned that with Nietzsche, he really raises this issue, maybe the truth really is terrible, right? Maybe God doesn't exist and nihilism is correct. We don't really matter and our lives have no ultimate purpose or value or anything like that. So if that's the case, right, if the truth is really terrible, if it's actually something that leads us to despair and it's in some sense perhaps better not to know, is it worth knowing that terrible truth, or is it better to live in a kind of comforting illusion? Now this brings us to this last point with Craig, which is a little bit different, but I think very closely related. Craig notes that the argument he's given us in this piece does not give us a reason to believe that God exists. Right? That's not what he's doing, and he's just very clear about that. He says, I'm not here trying to give you arguments, I'm not trying to give you reasons to believe that God exists. Right? That's not the topic. The topic is about the meaning of life. And so he's trying to give really an argument in favor of these two claims. Right? If God does exist, then life is meaningful. If God does not exist, then life is futile. These are the claims Craig himself puts together. Right? This is near the end of the piece. So we've got a pair of implication statements which really add up together to a sort of stronger kind of statement. Ultimately, what is it? Life can only be meaningful if God exists. Those two things go together, right? A meaningful life goes with the existence of God. If God doesn't exist, no lives can be meaningful. If lives aren't meaningful, God doesn't exist, right? And on the other hand, if God doesn't exist, life has to be futile, right? I was already saying this. So the things stand or fall together. God exists and lives are meaningful, right? They're either both true or they're both false. God doesn't exist, lives can't be meaningful. Then they're futile, as he puts it near the end of the piece. They're absurd, right? Meaningless. So that's really all Craig's been arguing for in this piece. Right? He hasn't argued in favor of the position that God actually exists. That's another conclusion, right? Other reasons would have to support that conclusion. Craig does explore some of those arguments. So of course, if you look through Reasonable Faith and his other publications, he has been writing about reasons to believe in God for a considerable amount of time. We're just not going to get into that in this class. Right? So in this class, we're not really engaging directly with the arguments about whether or not we should believe that God exists. Rather, we're engaged with issues about the meaning of life. So really what we want to do is, what Craig is in some sense doing here, and explore the relationship between the existence of God and questions of meaning. So I better sort of shrink myself down here for this last slide, stick myself over here in the middle. Ultimately, Craig thinks theism enables us to live consistently and happily, as he puts it. He admits that atheism might be true. It might be true that God doesn't exist. There's no transcendent reality. There's no ultimate purpose or value or significance to existence. That no lives are ultimately meaningful. But, he thinks, that kind of view is ultimately unlivable. Now, he says unlivable. There's a real question there about exactly what he means. Because, of course, he's already made it clear that the atheist cannot be consistently happy, but they can be inconsistently happy by sort of tricking themselves into thinking that they can have ultimate value and meaning and purpose and significance, right? Purpose, value, significance, that all adds up to meaning. So he thinks they can be inconsistently happy. So presumably what Craig's getting at here is that atheism is unlivable in the sense of you can't be an atheist, be consistent, and live a happy life. Though you could be an atheist inconsistently to happy life, or maybe you can be maybe if you're an atheist and consistent, ultimately have to commit suicide. I don't think Craig is committed to that latter view. I think he's willing to leave open, like Tolstoy, that somebody can be, an atheist, think that life is meaningless, and go on to live a meaningless existence. But a meaningless existence is going to be one that's unhappy, on Craig's account. So, atheism ultimately is bad. It's not going to give us what we want, right? You can't have a meaningful life if you're atheist. So Craig ultimately concludes, it is rational to live as a theist, right? To live as if God exists, and say Christianity, or, right, if we think other versions of theism can allow for a meaningful life, that it's rational, that it's really the smart thing to do. It's reasonable to live as a theist, to live believing that God exists, because it allows us to lead a good life, right? A meaningful life. Now, the way Craig closes, and the way he frames it, he says, it's rational to live as a theist, even if the evidence in favor, the rational evidence in favor of theism, is no better than it is in favor of atheism, right? A scientific, secular worldview. Now, Craig just doesn't touch on here the scenario where the evidence, and so again, hypothetically, conditionally, right? This is an if-then statement, right? If the evidence against theism were stronger than the evidence for theism, but were not overwhelming, right? Right. So let's say, Craig paints us a picture of the position, right? Imagine the evidence is 50-50, right? In favor of theism or sort of scientific atheism. In that case, if the evidence is dead even, you might as well live as a theist anyway, because then you can have a meaningful life. Because if you put your chips in with scientific atheism, you're not going to have a meaningful life. You're not going to have a good life. So he gives us that scenario, right? Now, of course, if the evidence for theism is even stronger than the evidence for scientific atheism, then Craig's going to say, then obviously be the theist. Not only are you being reasonable by following the evidence, but you're also leading a good life, right? That's a double win. Flipping it around, and this is really, I think, Nietzsche's question here. What if the evidence really stacks up against theism, right? What if the odds of theism being true actually seem very low based on the evidence we have, and the odds of scientific atheism being true are actually very high based on the evidence we have, right? And Nietzsche was arguably really making this point. He's saying, look, the more and more we explain things, the better and better science gets, the less and less we need God and religious explanations for things, right? Rather than trying to explain the weather in terms of divine beings, as say the ancient Greeks did, or even, right, more contemporary people still might. He says, look, we can explain it in terms of weather patterns, instead of trying to explain the existence of disease and all sorts of things by appealing to supernatural or theistic explanations. We just don't have to do that anymore. So the realm of useful sort of religious explanation shrinks and shrinks. If we get to the point where they just never really give us anything more, then would it still make sense to live as a theist because it allows for a meaningful life, even if it's really the evidence is against it? Craig just doesn't explore that option. But he does invoke Blaise Pascal, whose picture I've stuck up on the screen here, so you might have been looking at that, sort of wondering who this person was and if I was ever going to mention him. So Craig mentions Pascal, and you've probably heard of Pascal's wager at some point. So Pascal, 17th century French thinker, mathematician, religious philosopher, I suppose, died at quite a young age, unfortunately. In Pascal's Pensées, his thoughts, he's got this fairly famous passage where he really puts it into, puts religious belief into gambling terms. He says, look, really there's four alternatives here. God exists or doesn't exist, right? That's sort of one dimension, so there's two options. And then either you believe God exists or not, right? Now he says, think about this in sort of betting terms. So we've really got four possible scenarios, right? You believe God exists, right? God does exist. You believe God exists, God doesn't. You don't believe God exists, God exists. You don't believe God exists, God doesn't exist. Pascal says, okay, look, if God doesn't exist, right, and we can think about this in Craig's terms, if God doesn't exist, it doesn't really matter if you believe that God exists or not, right? Because you're going to live your life, and then once you're dead, well, guess what? Basically, Craig's point, there's no ultimate significance or value or purpose there. It really didn't matter what you did in your life. So it didn't matter if you believed in God or not, if God doesn't exist, right? So in the situation where God doesn't exist, it really doesn't matter what you believe. Nope, it doesn't matter. But if God does exist, all of a sudden it does matter what you believe during your life, because if you didn't believe God exists and God did exist, you just lost the jackpot, right? The ultimate jackpot, because for Pascal, if you believe that God exists and God does exist, what are you ultimately going to get? Eternal life. You're going to get eternal bliss. You get to go to heaven. You get the best thing ever. So if God doesn't exist, there's nothing to be gained or lost, right? It just doesn't matter. If God does exist, then as a result of your bet, right, whether you believe or not, you either get to go to heaven or not. So either you win, basically, in infinite good, right, something that never loses its value, it's always good, it lasts forever, or you lose out on that. So, Pascal concludes, it's only rational, in light of the fact that we just don't know for sure if God exists. It's only rational to believe that God does, right? Because if God exists and you believe God exists, you get the best reward ever. But if God exists and you don't believe, then you lose out on everything. So really, there's only one winning position, right? Believing in God and God actually existing. That's really the only condition that matters. That's the only one worth going for. So you're far better off believing than not. And this is really Craig's position here as well, right? Now, as I mentioned, Craig isn't quite clear exactly under what conditions he thinks this is the right way to live, but my guess is that Craig would think that even if the odds, the evidence is really stacked against theism, then you're better off living as a theist, because you still live a good life, and on the evidence could always be wrong, right? On the off chance we got things wrong, all of our best reasoning really messed up. Well, hey, like Pascal says, you're better off just believing anyway. Your life here, right, your limited, finite material life will go better, right? You'll have a comforting illusion. This would be putting it in Nietzsche's terms. And then, right, you never even find out you're wrong, so that, would you really lose? And if you turned out to be right, well, you just won something, better than anything else you could possibly ever have. So really, all you have is the possibility to win, and you can give up on that possibility by believing incorrectly in some sense. So this is really Craig's case. Craig isn't giving us an argument to actually show us that God exists, right? He's not trying to give us evidence for that, but he's argued in favor of this pair of claims that if God does exist, then life is meaningful. If God does not exist, then life is futile. So he thinks God existing and us having personal immortality are both necessary conditions of humans leading a meaningful life. Go ahead and just pop back to here for the end of the video. So God existing and us having personal immortality are necessary conditions for humans to have meaningful lives. Christian theism provides for that. Maybe other forms of theism do as well. Craig's not exactly clear on that. But he thinks ultimately if we can live as theists, right, if it's in our power to live that way, then we ought to live that way, precisely because it allows for a meaningful life. Because you just cannot be a consistent atheist and still be happy, because you have to admit on an atheistic scientific picture that ultimately there's no purpose, value, or significance, and hence no meaning to life. And without meaning, one cannot be happy. So with that, we'll leave Craig there. And next day, as I've mentioned before, we're going to take a look at Robert Nozick, who's going to raise some questions that intersect with what Craig has been saying here really quite well. Now, Nozick doesn't have full answers to all the questions, but he can certainly motivate them, I think, in a very nice way and raise some points worth considering. And then we're going to move on to taking a little bit of a closer look at, so we're going to take a look at Confucianism, another religious, in some sense, sort of view, one that gets us thinking about our connection to others, our relationships to others, our place in the world. And then we're going to get into thinking about the afterlife, questions of death and immortality in a little bit more detail. So until my next video, I hope you're all doing well, and you'll see me later. Bye for now.